This is Shirin from the University of Chicago. You are listening to UC3P.
Hi everyone, this is Susan Paykin, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. Today we'll travel to Santiago, Chile, where we'll hear from Claus Krebs, an attorney at the law firm Claus & Cia, specializing in intellectual property law. Our own David Raban interviewed Mr. Krebs last summer in Santiago, and their conversation ranged from discussing copyright protection in the arts and media to the ins and outs of the Chilean and international legal systems. But first, please remember to listen, subscribe, and rate this episode of UC3P. We so appreciate your listenership. Here's David, and enjoy the episode.
Hey podcasters, my name is David Raban, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Claus Krebs, a copyright attorney with Claus & Cia. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much, David. I'm very, very excited and very interesting opportunity.
Yes, I'm really excited to talk with you about some copyright stuff from my research. So to start, would you mind describing a little bit about the copyright system in Chile and what are some of its core features and what protections are given to people who are creating ideas?
Well, the copyright system is really, it is based mainly on copyright law, a specific copyright law that regulates most of the aspects that have to do with copyright in Chile. And it's called here Ley de Propiedad Intelectual, intellectual property law, but it is actually mostly about what is called here Derecho Autor, which is the right of the author with respect to his works. And that is the main emphasis, I would say, regarding how the system is made here. And it's an interesting nuance or distinction because copyright, I think it developed basically focused on the copies that a writer produced from his work and what to do and how to retain or market those copies and retain the rights on those copies. And I think the point of view is a little different in that here the law focuses mostly and the name tells that on the author and his or her works. I think the system here is, in its general characteristics and features, pretty similar and pretty standard nowadays to what is legislation elsewhere in the world. There have also been a few adjustments here to Chilean legislation after we entered a free trade agreement with the US in 2002, I think it was. And there were a few adjustments made here based on on specific agreements we made with the US after that in 2003 particularly, and after that as well to our legislation. For instance, one of the examples of that, duration of the protection of the works of an author was considerably shorter. Now it's 70 years after the author's death. Another change that is worth mentioning is there is an important concept in the US, which is the exhaustion of copyright rights, which I think has been developed there for quite a long time by jurisprudence and legislation as well. And this concept was introduced here by an amendment to the copyright law as well. So generally, what is important here is the act of creating a work. As soon as an author creates a work, he automatically acquires the right to the work he created. It has to have some artistic or some intellectual value. He has to organize that in a certain way. And the right also applies to not only creative artists, but also those who have performers and recordings, and of course also to software and architectural works and all kinds of stuff. Right?
Definitely. So my understanding is that the copyright law over even the last basically 175 years has changed dramatically. There was some kind of decree in 1834 which first gave all the rights to the authors. Then in 1925, the system pretty dramatically changed to the extent that instead of what you were just mentioning, where the creation is where the protection comes in, it was from registration. And then 1975, it reverted back to that original format, which is the similar format to what we have today and what is in the United States and maybe in a lot of other countries that have signed agreements and conventions and whatnot, where basically the creation is what gives you the copyright.
Yes.
And then 2002, these changes happened, but also in 2010 is specifically where a lot of the new fair use doctrines have come in. So a lot of changes in the last 175 years.
Yes, a lot. Yeah, as you said, that there was even some basic mentions of intellectual property rights in the first drafts of the constitutions that were made here after Chile gained its independence in the 19th century, early 19th century. But yes, I think it was a pretty obscure matter for most part of our history, and I think that with the very explosive, I would say, integration in the few years of Chile into particularly through signing free trade agreements and other kinds of agreements with other countries and with the European Union and the US in particular, this has put a lot of pressure, and I would say that in a good way, a lot of pressure on the government to improve local legislation and strengthen it and also enforce it in a more active manner. There was even a specific police brigade created in the last few years, specifically with that objective in mind, to better enforce IP in all its manifestations.
This is in the PDI IP, so the brigade.
Yes.
My understanding is that this is a brigade within the police department and investigations to find these things.
We have two police forces in Chile. One is more, they overlap a lot, but one is more in charge of public order, and the other is more in charge of investigations and going after criminals, and that's the PDI that you mentioned, and that's a specific brigade within PDI, and that was previously unheard of.
I don't even know if they have something similar to that in the United States. I mean, they have the FBI, obviously, but specifically for matters of copyright, I know that the FBI has a white-collar crime division, which I suppose is what this would be in. But it does seem almost like a unique type of feature of the Chilean system to have this.
I think the purpose was to give a strong sign that in Chile, trademark and IP and copyright infringements and patent infringements or whatever would not be treated lightly anymore. And I think this is part of a campaign to make people more aware of these kinds of rights and the protection of these kinds of rights, because traditionally it was not really regarded as something, I mean by the public at large, something that really was, I don't know, very important, or that really had to be respected, and even till this day, I mean, it is something we have to deal with every day.
Yes, and in the United States, there's huge problems with copyright infringement and enforcement and stealing and pirating, and there's even things like patent trolling and stuff like that. So a lot of different problems that exist in the system. At this point, what would you say is one of the, or a few of the bigger problems that still exist with the copyright system, things that might need to be changed moving forward?
But I think in the US, at least, the public is more aware of those rights, and perhaps there is more controversy about to what extent those rights are justified or to what extent you enforce them. And in the case of patent trolling, I think the discussion is to what extent are you abusing those rights. But that requires that people are more educated about the subject, and I think it's another level of discussion. I think the discussion here, or what it's about, is more, still more in a developmental phase. I mean, what we're doing here, what we're discussing about, is that these rights actually exist, and that people are aware of that and respect them these rights to a greater degree.
Yeah, when I was meeting earlier with the Copyright Office, I think from what I understood, there's something like only 10,000 copyrights done in the country every year, which is a very low number. It doesn't
registrations,
include
you mean?
registrations.
Yeah.
And it doesn't include some things like pseudonyms and other things, which are a pretty small percentage of them. But there's something like, I think it was either 200,000 or 800,000 copyright registrations in all of Chilean history, which is a pretty small amount if you think about it, considering that right now I think there's something like 17 million people in the country. Some people create much more than other people. Obviously, not everyone is going to do a copyright. Probably less than 1% of even Americans do copyrights. But you would imagine that some people do many, many copyrights. For example, if you're an author and you write a book, you're probably not going to just write one book. You'll write maybe 5 or 10 books over the course of your lifetime. People who make songs, albums, they'll do many, many different pieces and different records and stuff like that. It was interesting to me that it felt like such a small number, and that people, like you're saying, are not even aware that they have these rights to go do these things. But when I'm walking down the street, there's so much art, sculptures, paintings, murals.
I think that the people that consistently register copyrights here are probably publishing companies and music recording companies and people that really more actively work in the industry and who more
they
require the registration more than anybody else, because there is, for instance, there's no obligation here of including a copyright notice. You don't really have to do that, and you can always prove your right in court. I mean, what you get with a registration is merely a presumption in your favor that you are the author, but that can be. I mean, if somebody proves otherwise, then that can be torn down, so to speak. So, the incentive to go and register something is sometimes not really that large, perhaps, unless you are a publishing company or something. For those people, I think this is pretty standard work, so it's part of what they do, and that's probably why they do it.
That makes sense. Is there an estimate of what percentage of works that are copyrightable actually aren't copyrighted, or is it just impossible to know because people are making ideas all the time and they're inscribing those ideas into different mediums like paper and sculptures and artwork and books and music, and it's just impossible to really have a sense of what's being made?
I think so. Yeah, I couldn't tell. No, for instance, even software companies here. I mean, we have discussed that a lot of times with clients. Even software companies here, many times, even if they create software, they will choose not to go to the Copyright Office and register that, because I think they fear that their source code is going to be stolen or something like that. And I think that's the kind of things that still keep people away from registering their work. And I think there's also some kind of intuition that as long as you're the author and you can prove that you're the author, you're protected by this copyright law. So, yeah.
That's so interesting. That it simultaneously, some people don't know about it, some people are worried about it, and some people just feel like they don't need it. And then all of those things come together to not necessarily diminish the system, but it's clearly underutilized. Especially as the Copyright Office recently moved to the Ministry of Arts, Culture, and Heritage from what was the Department of Education. Yeah. And that just happened earlier this month.
Sub-department of a division of that was in charge of museums, libraries, and archives. And
one thing I've noticed is that the system here in some ways is a lot simpler than it is in the United States. For example, if you want to do music in the United States, you need to understand the difference between, mechanical royalties and performance rights, which don't exist in the United States. And you need to usually have a record company, and signing up with the Copyright Office can be quite onerous. One of the things I really liked about the system here was that it seemed pretty simple to do a copyright. It's not very, very hard to do it. You just have to give a description of the work, maybe give like a cassette or some kind of like